Yeah. Luke, did you want to say some stuff?
No.
I don't know. Luke chapter 2, and we finally, after all this time, got into the birth narrative. We've looked at, the pre-birth life of Jesus, and we looked at gospel criticism as a source of how we understand Jesus, understand his life, and we looked at the ministry of John the Baptist and the annunciation of the birth of Jesus and the life of Mary. And last week we talked about the Marian dogmas, and now we are actually getting to the birth of Christ. So yes, we're cruising right along.
At 5 miles an hour.
Yeah, basically at about 5 miles an hour. And it's one of those things I always worry about whether or not I'm going to have enough to say, and I always have more to say. I do.
I'm sorry, I don't mean that
No,
rude, but I'm
it's-
just like, seriously, you have so much information in your brain. How could you not?
I always worry about that. I'm like, boy, is that going to be enough? We're going to cover this. Is that going to be enough? And then I'm always like, oh, if I could just say 10 more things about this right here. And that's kind of okay because, this is one of those things is like, I know that it's structured kind of like a seminary class. We are getting into deep theology when we do this kind of thing. It's a little bit more than just, a basic Bible study. It's not any more than what a basic Bible study should be, I should say. But we're not restricted by, the quarter or something like that, where I've got to cover this in, 12 lessons and then make sure you have.
Friday, so just so you know.
Quarter ends Friday and we made it to the birth, right? Okay. So, Luke chapter 2, we are going to be talking about the birth of Christ, and we are going to be talking about the importance of the virgin birth of Christ and some of the issues that surround that issue. And then we're going to be talking about, in the birth of Christ, we're going to be talking about the Levitical background of what was being done at the birth of Christ, and some other apologetic issues that you might run into. And then if we have time, we will kind of summarize the first 3 chapters here of the book of Luke and what the author is kind of driving towards, so we can kind of see it from more of a back angle, more of a sky, because there is kind of a method to the first 3 chapters. We did study the 3rd chapter when we studied the ministry of John the Baptist, so we went ahead and went there. So we'll look at the contrast and comparison if we have time. So let's start. In verse 1, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each in his own town. And Josephus also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her first son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. And the same region there were shepherds in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, that will be for all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, laying in a manger." And suddenly there is with the angel a multitude of heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those whom he is well pleased." When the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go over to Bethlehem and see the things that happen, which the Lord has made known to us." And he went in haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. And when he saw it, he made known the saying that had been told to them concerning the child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen and had been told them. And at the end of 8 days, when he was circumcised, when he called Jesus the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when it came time for their purification according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written in the law of the Lord. Every male who opens the womb should be called holy to the Lord, and to offer sacrifice according to what was said in the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there's a man. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we'll go on with Anna and Simeon, hopefully later. If not, then not. Okay, so let's talk for a second about the virgin birth and why this is important. Why did Jesus have to be born of a virgin, and what does it mean that he was have to be born of a virgin? Well, I would say that the first reason why it was important was because of fulfilled prophecy. Okay, I would say that that's the most important. That's one of the most important things. In the Old Testament, it was foretold that the virgin would conceive and bear a child. Now, this actually goes way back, and we're going to look way back to Genesis chapter 3. So turn to Genesis chapter 3. And verse 15, or actually we can start in verse 14. This is after the fall. We know the story of the fall. It says, "And the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat, and all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring." Some say your seed and her seed. Is that what yours says? Is yours?
Nope, I have offspring.
Oh, it does? Okay. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, a lot of things could be said about this, but one of the things that's very important to see is that this is the offspring of the woman. In other words, what God is saying here is that in this offspring here, there is no male contribution. It is between the seed of the woman and the seed of Satan. And a lot of people, we didn't really even understand up until the modern scientific world that the woman actually contributed to the birth. They thought back in these days that the woman just produced, this just was the gestation area. It was, all the male contribution. It was just actually the gestation, that the women just provided the gestation box for the child to be born. But they didn't understand that the woman actually has a contribution to the fetus, to the baby. But God did. And God said that this was going to be the seed of the woman. There's going to be no male contribution given. So, that's one reason, is fulfilled prophecy. I would say the second reason is that Jesus comes as the second Adam, as opposed to the first Adam. And this is another reason why there's no male contribution. So the first Adam is not simply made ex nihilo. God made the whole world ex nihilo in the very beginning, but from that point he used the stuff that was here to make things. So the first Adam is dust plus what?
Breath.
Breath of God. Right, the breath of God. Breath of God, and that equals Adam, right? Okay, so that's the first Adam. So the second Adam is, what's the second Adam? Yeah, but
Should I remove the stopper?
no.
Keep it there?
It's okay
Okay.
if you want to. So the second Adam is, well, I would say dust, again, just in this. What happened?
He said if you want to, he's like,
Okay.
Is
then.
dust plus what? The breath of God. It says the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you and overshadow you, and what will be born to you will be holy. All right. So I would say the breath of God again, because breath and spirit are the same words. It's kind of difficult. It's just kind of the same words.
kind of
Breath
like
and
when it
spirit.
says all scripture is God breathed.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's one of those tricky ones that you just have to look at the context in order to find out what's being meant. Wind, breath, spirit are all kind of the same words. Okay. The third reason, and actually let's digress here for a second. Because by dust, obviously, it's not just dust, but we are all dust, so ultimately it's dust.
Minerals and all the stuff that the human body is made of.
Right. But one of the things that's important to understand this, and I'm going to digress on this for just a second, is that what we must understand is that Jesus was made from Mary's, as the older people put it, Mary's substance. We would say Mary's egg, okay? Mary's, what do you call it? I forgot, I don't even know.
Ovum.
Ovum, there we go.
Yeah,
Mary's
yes.
ovum. No male contribution, no sexual contribution, but sometimes in the Christian mind what we think is this is blank space in here, and that God just put another perfect human in there. Now this is very important to understand that that's not the case, that God just didn't put this very person in here. And it's not the case for some very important reasons. Number one, it says that it would be the seed of the woman. In other words, there's going to be a
Contribution.
true
I see.
relationship.
To Mary.
Well, a true relationship to Mary, and then to who?
Humanity.
Yeah, to Adam. Adam. A true relationship to Adam. Okay, there's a true relationship to Adam that's being spoken of here. And then further down in the covenant is the true relationship to David. Remember what God promised David?
Sit
One
on
of
his throne.
your offspring will sit on your throne. Jesus is truly related to David and truly related to you and me through Adam. Okay? Adam, obviously posthumously, because Eve comes out of the rib of Adam. But there is a viable connection there. So don't think of the virgin birth as simply God ex nihilo creating Jesus in the womb of Mary without contribution of humanity. It's contribution of no male part of humanity, but it is contribution of the egg. Jesus had DNA. He was truly related to you. He was truly the offspring of David. He was true, the prophecies in the Old Testament, the offspring of David. He is truly the offspring of Adam. And the reason why that is important is because then he can redeem you. He can redeem humanity. Now,
Kinsman redeemed.
yeah, he's our kinsman redeemer.
And only because of the constituents of the ovum of Mary, right? That's the reason that he's truly.
Yeah, he's truly human, and he's truly not just human, he's truly related to you
Right.
through Adam. Further back we go. He's truly the fulfillment of the offspring of David. Now, I said to you a while back that we will talk more about the nature of Christ and his two natures. And one of the natures that's overlooked in these days is his humanity. And the reason why that's overlooked is because theology kind of develops where the fight's happening. You know, we kind of all got it in our mind. We're ready to fight against, you know, X atheist or X false religion or something like that, because they're coming and knocking at the door and saying, well, we don't believe in the deity of Christ, or they have some subpar belief in the deity of Christ. So what we've done in the last, I would say 100 years now, well, maybe even further back, is begin, maybe back into the 1800s, is begin to talk about the deity of Christ. And we've got all our verses that demonstrate the deity of Christ. But what has happened is then we've been so accustomed to talking about the deity of Christ and so defending on the deity of Christ's front that we forget his true humanity. And we forget that the actual first heresy was an affront not on the deity of Christ, but was an affront on the humanity of Christ through the Gnostic Gospels and the Proto-Gnostics, the Docetic heresy. Docetism means to see. And the Docetic heresy was the heresy that said that Jesus wasn't really human, you know, that he only kind of came down and he appeared to be human. And this is why in 1 John, where it says that this is the spirit of the Antichrist, that he who does not believe that Christ came in the flesh is of the Antichrist. That was the first heresy that they were dealing with. The reason they were dealing with that heresy is because they were dealing with Greek concepts. And Greek concepts are that everything material is bad. Everything material is inferior, and God's not inferior, so how could God possibly be a human? Because everything here is just inferior. I mean, we just can't even put our minds around how inferior this world is and how bad this world is. So obviously, if Jesus is God, then he couldn't possibly be human. And this is why, actually, as you go through the Bible, there's a lot said about the deity of Christ, but there's a lot said about the humanity of Christ as well. And Jesus acts more as a human in this world than he did divine. I think, and I've touched on this before, we have this idea that Jesus walks around as a human, and we get it, we understand, yes, he's human, we get that, but we kind of think that every time he needed a miracle done, he just kind of tapped into his divinity. You know, he's like, well, I need to turn water into wine, and so I tap into mine, so I access my divinity to do that. That's not what happened. Jesus said, I don't do anything except for what the Father tells me to do. What he's doing is he's acting like the perfect person. And if you have that view, then you're going to run into some problems. Remember where Jesus couldn't perform many miracles because of the lack of faith that was in there? Well, I mean, if he couldn't perform, if he's God, how could he not perform many miracles because of the lack of faith? Well, because when he performed miracles, he wasn't just tapping into his deity. He was truly acting like the perfect man, able in such an accord with God that if God needed a human to do a miracle, he did that miracle. So remember that. Remember, everything you can say about humanity can be said about Jesus except for sin. Everything you can say about deity can be said about Jesus except, but deity you can say about Jesus. It's just I think we're all on board more with the deity because of what we have to deal with on a weekly basis. Dealing with our Jehovah's Witness friends, dealing with our Mormon friends, we're much more competent to talk about the deity of Christ. But it was the substance of Mary that was used. Now the third reason why there is a virgin birth is a little bit debated. But I'm going to give you the reason anyway, and that was because Jesus needed to be without sin. So this has been debated throughout history, but it basically says that it is the male contribution that passes on the lineage of sin. So this is why God withheld the male contribution. Now, you're not going to find a lot of biblical justification for that view. Okay, it's not, but it is a view that has been held in the past. Regardless of whether or not that's true or not, we'd have to say this, that sin is a curse placed on humanity. And that whatever that was, that God just withheld that curse from Jesus. Jesus was not born with the curse of sin upon him. He was made perfect. So he was the perfect person. All right, truly born. Now let's go back to Luke chapter 2.
Luke 2.
Luke chapter 2.
To what?
Hang on.
1 through 25.
What we read so
He
far.
just said 2 though.
And
He
it
didn't
said
say-
1 through 25.
She's saying 1 through 25.
Oh, I
That's what-
thought
that's
Because you weren't here.
was.
That's what
You weren't
we've read
here.
so far.
How do you know? That's pretty good.
All right. Verse 21.
'Cause I'm the teacher's pet.
Right. And at the end of 8 days, now at the end of 8 days, when he was circumcised, he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, they brought him to Jerusalem and presented him to the Lord, as it was written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer sacrifice according to what was said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves and 2 young pigeons. Okay, so let's stop there. So the second thing that I want us to understand out of this birth narrative, first thing I wanted us to understand is the importance of the virgin birth. And the second thing I want us to see about this birth narrative is that Jesus keeps the law, and he keeps the law in a little bit of an unusual way. By first of all, wasn't his decision, but I think that Jesus would have agreed with this, and that is that he was circumcised. So we got to see this is where we're going to see keep the law here. His parents keep the law. Keep the law. The idea of circumcision was the covenant that God made with Abraham that was picked up by Moses when Moses instituted, or God through Moses instituted the Mosaic covenant, was that the foreskin of the male child would be cut away as a sign of purification. That was basically the idea behind the sign. Behind the sign was this idea of purification. And there's a lot of birth rituals that we're going to see, birth types of rituals in the Old Testament that we're going to see. Now, first of all, why does Jesus, and Jesus is later baptized, why does Jesus have to keep this? He doesn't need to be cleansed. Does he need to be cleansed?
Because of his humanity, because of his soul.
Well, he has a soul, but he doesn't have a sinful soul. He doesn't have anything in his soul that needs to be cleansed.
It's fulfilling prophecy.
It is fulfilling the prophecy. Yes, he's fulfilling prophecy for
He's
sure.
an example.
But I like that. He's an example. That's for one. But he's what?
Fulfilling the old covenant.
He's fulfilling the old covenant. Look at Matthew chapter 3, verse 15. This is at his birth. Not at his birth, but at his baptism. Because, he says, why should I baptize you? John says to him.
Yeah,
But
not worthy to.
yeah. But Jesus answered, because Jesus didn't need to be baptized. He doesn't need any sin. Now, baptism doesn't save you, but it's the symbol that you are going through God's covenant commands of cleansing. But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for thus it is fitting to fulfill all righteousness. Now, Jesus didn't have to fulfill righteousness for himself, but Jesus had to fulfill all righteousness for us. Another verse is, look at Galatians chapter 4,
What was the one we were just on, Matthew? What?
Matthew
3:15.
And the next one we're looking at?
Galatians 4.
Oops.
In verse 4.
4:4, huh?
Galatians 4:4.
All right. What is the fullness of time?
But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might be appointed as sons. Okay? So you understand that? He was born, and the fullness of time had come. God sent his Son to be born under the law, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law. Because what was the point of the law? What's the big point of the law? It isn't, you can't get redeemed through it.
To show us our sin.
To demonstrate our sins. It's to demonstrate that we can't do it. Now, we are incapable of doing it, not because there's an insufficiency in the law. We're incapable of doing it because there's an insufficiency within us. There's even a point where I can't, and this is just coming to my mind right now, I'm sorry, I forgot the verse, where God says, you should be able to keep this. This isn't too hard for you. Well, what's he speaking of? Why was he saying it too hard? But on the other hand,
It's impossible.
we see that it's impossible.
Yeah.
Is he playing games? Well, no. Jesus comes as remember we've talked about this before, Jesus comes as the true Israel of God. It shouldn't be too hard for us. In other words, the constraint isn't outward in the law. The constraint is inward in us. The problem is us, the problem's not with the law. Now this is something that we talked about with total depravity a while ago, and I think it was St. Anselm who gave this example. So here's this guy, and he's told to keep and tend the garden. Okay, he said, you tend the garden, I'm going to come back. And he tells him, he says, look, you got to get in there, you got to pull the weeds out, you got to spray it for bugs, you're going to pull the bugs off, do this. At the end of the day, no problem. It shouldn't be too bad, shouldn't be too hard for you. Says, but don't go over to this well, because you go over to this well, you're not going to be able to get out. And let's say, for example, that there's no way to dig out or whatever. So this person, as soon as the tender is gone, or the owner is gone, he goes and he now falls into the well. He's very unhappy, as you can see by the look on his
Cut his
face.
head off and let it fall.
Right? And the owner comes by and he says, why haven't you done what I command? And he says, I can't. Now, is it the truth that he can't do it?
Yes.
From the position that he's in, he can't do it.
Pathetically so,
Right,
yes.
pathetically so. Now, is it that he couldn't do it if he didn't fall into the pit?
Yeah.
No, he could.
He could do it if he didn't fall into the pit. That's the position that Christ is in. He's in the position of not having fallen into the pit, so he is able to keep the commandments of God. This is why it isn't, well, I shouldn't say not difficult, but it isn't too difficult for him. It's not so difficult that he couldn't do it. Not to say that there wouldn't be difficulty, but it's not too difficult for him. So he does it, not for himself, but he does it as the new lawgiver, as the new Moses, as the new Adam
So
for
it
you.
is easy for us to keep up the commandments of God then, all 10?
Well, it depends on what you mean by is it easy.
Well, I just thought that you were saying that.
It's not easy.
Yeah, that's what,
It's horribly not easy.
okay.
But it's not easy because of you
Oh, because
and
of
me,
us.
and not because of the law. If
Right.
you didn't have sin, it would be easy. The corruption is inward, not from that. Now, let's have a look then. As we understand the law, we must understand it that God has put the law to demonstrate certain things. We talked a Sunday about archetypes. We've talked before about archetypes. Well, we're going to get into some more of the not necessarily archetypes, but paradigms. And once you understand the paradigm, then you understand, the whole Old Testament. You understand why the Old Testament was written and why weird things happen, and you go, what's that about? We've seen some of these before. It's like, when you understand the paradigm in which God is trying to demonstrate, then you go, okay, I get it now, and I can see it more clearly. So there's sacrifices that are made. So he's circumcised, and then there's sacrifices that are made. These sacrifices go back to Leviticus chapter 12. So turn to Leviticus chapter 12.
No, but I'm on Deuteronomy. Don't make me go
Are ya?
back. Don't make me go back.
Yeah.
Hopefully this will.
Are you reading from the ESV?
Yes.
Because you changed some.
I probably went quickly. Too
you
quickly.
actually
Oh, yeah,
said
Leviticus 12.
Yes. Purification after childbirth.
Purification after childbirth, right? We're going to see that what Moses commanded here, and then how they kept those commandments. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as at the time of her menstruation. She shall be unclean, and on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood 33 days in the blood of her purifying. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are complete. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks,
This is long.
as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in her blood of her purification for 66 days. So the time is doubled. The time is doubled. Now, so why is the time doubled and the time of the male child is not doubled? Now, let me give you the bad answer to this. The bad answer to
Patriarchal
this is,
society,
is-
misogynist.
yeah,
Jerks, right?
is there was something that you could do for the male child that you couldn't do for the female child, and that was circumcision. So to demonstrate that time was over, the child was circumcised. But for the female, there isn't anything you can do, so you doubled the time of the unclean period. Now, if we were going through this much more slowly, much more methodically, I would spend a lot of time here, but I want to spend a little bit of time in understanding this. So understand that there's a difference between unclean and sinful, okay? Kind of. Unclean is typologically sinful, but not necessarily actually sinful. So, typologically, she's unclean because of the blood menstruation and because of the child and because of this. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with her sinfully, in and of that self, in and of itself. This is a natural thing that happens. What's wrong with that? Nothing's wrong with it. Well, then why does she have to be set aside and not touch anything? Okay. The unclean aspect was to demonstrate the sinfulness of our society and how deep sinfulness goes. Okay. Now, sinfulness. So if there is an adulterer, if you touch the adulterer, he wouldn't spread his adulterousness to you. You wouldn't be unclean, right? I mean, somebody who's a thief. It doesn't say anything in the law. It doesn't say anything in the law about, well, if you touch a thief, then you have to go and be,
Ceremonial.
cleansed or make an atonement or something like that. But there is a difference between uncleanliness and sinfulness in of itself. And the difference is that this is a picture. Okay, the uncleanliness is a picture. It's a picture of sin, which is part of what the Old Testament is driving at, to show you how infectious this sin is. And this is why there are times when Jesus kept this kind of law and times when he didn't. This is very important for you to understand. There were times when Jesus kept this kind of law. So was it unclean to touch a dead body?
Yeah.
Was it unclean to touch a leper?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it was. It was unclean.
it?
Yeah, unclean to touch a leper.
I don't think so.
So you touched a leper, then you had to be set aside for a certain amount
That's
of days
true,
and
'cause
stuff
then
like that. And then,
if the house, like if there was anything on the walls, or if there was anything on the wood or the linens or anything like that, you were considered unclean, but you had to clean the items
Right.
and set it before the priest.
right.
You would get leprosy if you touched one, wouldn't you?
You wouldn't get it necessarily, but you might.
Oh.
You can, but you might. It's actually pretty hard to get leprosy. Yeah, you
I
actually
didn't
have
know
to.
that.
You have to be in a lot of contact. It has to be pretty filthy.
I thought it was easy.
It's not that easy.
Okay, that's
Um, Jesus touched lepers. Jesus touched dead people. And the idea behind that, well, why could he violate the law? And that, well, he's not violating the law. He's showing that what happens when he touches a woman who had a blood
I
menstruation.
was just gonna say, when the woman reached out and touched his robes, that would have made him unclean too. right?
Yeah,
Mm.
she became healed. When he touched the dead body became alive. When he touched the leper was healed. You see what he's trying to, what Jesus is trying to show here is, yes, he comes under the law to fulfill the law, but he also comes to reverse the curse. He comes to reverse the curse. This is what this is showing. This is why there had to be the big deal about about the birth of Christ is the reversal of the curse. That's the big deal. This is why there had to be a sacrifice made, a sacrifice of sin. The picture that's being demonstrated, so look here in verse 6. It says, "And when the days of her purification are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make an atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood." Then it goes on, but it says, "Then if the law of for
This is
her."
the law, yeah.
This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female, and if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and one for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. So this shows the economic status of them as well, just as a side note. They're not rich. This was definitely before the wise men came and visited them and bestowed them of some riches. But they weren't rich people, so they had to offer the 2 turtle doves. So what is the point of offering the sin offering? I mean, you think about it, you're like, childbirth's the most natural thing. This is great. Why is God, what is it that's so awful about this that needs to be atoned for by a sin offering? It says here this is a sin offering. So what's the picture being communicated? Here's the picture. Sin, remember what Isaiah said? He said that even our righteous works are like filthy rags before the Lord.
60-something.
Yeah.
Use menstrual cloth.
Yeah, or as
Yeah.
menstrual cloth before the Lord. What he's saying, what's being communicated here, is that you take the most perfect, most beautiful thing under the curse of God, and it's unclean. The perfect, most beautiful thing under the curse is viewed as something that needs to be atoned for. It's a picture. It's a picture of how infectious sin is. That even we can go to the most noblest thing in the world, the birth of, well, kind of the most noblest thing is the birth of a child. And we say, under the curse, even that good thing is considered to be impure.
David said, I was conceived in sin.
Exactly, yes, I was conceived.
What
in
is the
sin.
curse of God? They mean sin?
Well, the curse of God is found in Genesis chapter 3. Yeah, I mean, we're sinners, there's the effect, and then there's the curse. So the effect of sin was that we don't have fellowship with God anymore. See, so when they sin, then God comes down and Adam and Eve run. That's the picture of humanity now. We're on our way. We're not trying to find God. As soon as sin comes down, as soon as God shows up, we're out of here. Then the curse of sin is found in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 and following, where it talks about women shall,
So
have
you mean the curse of sin then,
the
okay.
curse of sin. So that even the most perfect thing that we can produce is sinful. The other thing is I think that's being communicated here, is that there is a way in which you can look righteous. I mean, I can fool you into being more righteous than I really am.
Mhm.
Now, some of you here, you know me, and you know that when I not thinking, I'll drop some curse words that I shouldn't say, and well, you don't even know the half of it, quite honestly.
Or? I hope not.
But that's what Charles Spurgeon said. Charles Spurgeon said, when somebody's saying something bad about you, you should go to him and say, you don't even know the half of it.
Yeah, like me.
I like that.
But there's something about the fact that it doesn't matter how much of a good face you put on, what you produce is sinful. You're going to produce a sinner.
Well,
That's all there
why
is to
That's
it.
why it says it's not what you put in your body,
What comes
it's
out.
what comes out.
Right, yes. And the biggest thing that you can see in what you produce are your children. That's
Sinners
it.
beget sinners.
You're going to be
Oh,
sinners.
yeah.
Sinners beget
My kids are
sinners.
better than your kids.
Sinners beget sinners.
So turn back to Luke chapter
Morally,
2.
yes.
Jason, you have any children?
Just one.
Oh yeah, me too, just one.
Luke chapter 2, and now another issue, apologetic issue that I want to talk about is this idea of the censor that's being issued here. In chapter 2 and verse 1 it says, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, I don't know if you've read that book over here. I talked about it last time, and I shouldn't be so hard on it. It's not a bad book, but The Case for Christ. I think
You don't like that book?
no, I like it. It's okay. I mean, it's decent kind of pop level apologetics. There's some stuff in there. The methodology that's used in the book, I don't buy into. I don't buy into that methodology. But it's a good book that will present some of the facts that can be used to embarrass the unbeliever.
Well, you don't believe there's anything false in them, do you?
Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't know right off the top of my head. I mean, there might be some apologetic issue that we might quabble over, but I'm not sure.
Because I recommend that book to lots of
I would
people.
recommend it too.
And the case for
I would rather have somebody read that than not read it.
Mhm.
I like. There are other books I like better.
Do you like it more than it's The Case for Faith, or?
I actually like The Case of Faith for Faith better.
Okay.
I like that
The
book
Case
better.
for
I found that book more appealing. It was more philosophical than that one. Okay. one of the things that you might run into is you'll run into somebody who says that, how can this be? Because we all know, and this part's true, from Josephus, that Quirinius issued a decree to register the world in 6 AD. 6 AD is way too late, and this is according to Josephus. And Herod died around 4 BC, and this would have been well before Herod, but well before Herod died, I should say. So how can you say, this is one of those things that people will bring up, that if they, sometimes people will bring it up if they know something about biblical criticism, but you might run into it. Okay, so how can you say that Quirinius issued this in 6 AD, the Bible must be wrong, right? Because this is happening before 6 AD. Am I making sense? Does that make sense?
Interesting. Oh boy.
Okay, let's go through this again. All right. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay? According to Josephus,
That was
6 AD. So did this happen before Christ or after Christ in here?
Because with the way that, yeah,
Yep.
if you go by Josephus, then
After.
there's a problem.
Okay, so, but in here it says what? Is it before Christ or after Christ? Before,
It'd have to be before.
This
because
would
he
be
hasn't
before,
been
right?
born.
right? Okay. So Josephus says this happened in, well, Josephus says there was a controversial registration by Quirinius in 6 AD, is what he said. So how do we solve this alleged contradiction? Well, there have been a couple ways to solve this. I'm going to give you a couple of them that people have said in the past. Okay. And I'm going to give you kind of my favorite one too. The first one is that there is a manuscript that mentions somebody who governed twice. But he governed twice in 2 different eras. In other words, he was elected for governor and then he was a governor. And so some people have said that some very scholarly people said that was Quirinius. I'm going to put Q there just because I don't want to spell that whole name out. And that it wasn't this, that Josephus is talking about the second registration that was more controversial, and the Bible here is talking about the first registration, which wasn't controversial at all. I mean, it wasn't, it doesn't seem like anybody was too upset about it, other than they had to travel. That's one possibility. However, the defect in that is that this manuscript that mentions that that this person governed twice doesn't mention Quirinius. It doesn't say, it just said there was a governor who ruled twice at 2 different times, 2 different eras. So, and that one of those eras, the person made a census, so they say Quirinius is a good example of that. Not my favorite one, but some people follow that. The second one is by looking at this word first, and it's Greek word protos. Because protos doesn't have to mean first, but it can also mean before. This is where one of those things, and I'll give you a couple examples of this, where words are tricky. So especially prepositions. What's a preposition? Anybody know?
That's a good one.
Do you know what it is?
I don't know how to define it.
Okay.
I know a bunch of examples.
So a preposition is a word that shows a relationship.
I like that.
And this is going to be how you're going to remember this from now on.
Between
So I always
two
I always like talking about the trash can. This is how I learned it. So, and a piece of trash. So here's the piece of trash. Now the piece of trash can be in the trash can, So in's a preposition. It can be outside the trash can, outside's a preposition. It can be before the trash can, above the trash can, behind the trash can. All those are prepositions. Preposition shows a relationship between two objects. So preposition. Now prepositions are tricky. They're tricky words. So if I asked Jason, who's above you at work? Well, what do you mean above? Is that
Floating?
yeah, floating. What I mean by above there is who's a
authority
boss,
over you.
who's has authority over you, right? Okay. We also run into this problem in the Bible because we talk about when somebody says they are baptized for the
We like to see
remission
it.
of sins. Now, for there doesn't mean in order to gain. Like I go to the store for a bag of potatoes. That means for. Say I went to the store for a bag of potatoes. But I also say I take aspirin for my headache. I don't take aspirin in order to get my headache. I'm like, I'm taking it, okay?
I like
So
that.
prepositions they're tricky words. They have to be
Yeah.
defined in context.
You like to say the secretary is under her boss. you know.
Yeah. Right. That is one of
Good one,
them.
man.
What do we mean? Could be a double entendre there,
Double
right?
entendre, you
So
bet.
prepositions are tricky words. And some have said that the word protos here can just as easily in the Greek mean that the registration was before Quirinius was in government, was put into government. So that would solve the contradiction as well. And then the last one that I probably think that maybe that one is generally right. That probably what he's talking about is that this is before Quirinius was put into government. But the third one I think is important, and it's important to understand because it's that of authority. In other words, when somebody comes along and says, well, Josephus says that this happened in AD 6 AD, and you're saying it happened before Herod died, so the Bible must be wrong, what's the presupposition? What is that person really saying?
The whole Bible, yeah.
No.
Nope.
Well, they might be saying that, but that's not what they're saying this. They're saying Josephus is more reliable than the Bible. And that's an arbitrary position. So I just want to ask the person, well, why do you believe that Josephus is more? As a matter of fact, Josephus has been proven wrong on many points. Now, not all points. He's generally a good historian. But Luke, in every time that we can test him, every time that we can test Luke, he's always been right, and like extremely right, like down to the minute kind of detail right. For example, one of the things that happened, and you can look at this in the book by Sir William Ramsay. I think we all know the story of the guy who wanted to prove the Bible wrong, and he went and he used the book of Acts, and he said, look, everything that this person said, every name that he mentioned that we could uncover, every place that he said that there was a place, if there's not a place now, is found in the book of Acts. So why am I believing Josephus over Luke? And one of the places, like one of the things that's specific about Luke is he's saying things like, it's like the difference between like a cop and a sheriff, or a police officer or a sergeant and a sheriff. Now, if you're telling a story, you might just say, oh, the law enforcement over in St. George. You know, you might summarize it. You might not distinguish necessarily between like a sheriff who pulled you over or a police officer. Luke actually does. He uses the appropriate terms in government. He says, oh, this was a politarch, or this was another type of person. He uses those kind of nuances that when they find out, they're like, whoa, exact kind of coins that were found that he mentions. Coins that you would only find during that era, during that place, because they were only minted over in that place. You find with them. So I always like this question of authority. And by the way, Josephus has been known to be wrong, to inflate things. And, you know, like when you compare him to Tacitus on the Roman wars, you know, Josephus always has more people who died in battle than other people. So he has been proven to be wrong. The other thing about Josephus is that Josephus, every time we dig up a new copy of Josephus's work, there's always some discrepancy. We've seen this if you watch The Star of Bethlehem. If you watch that show, The Star. You haven't seen that movie, The Star of Bethlehem? Oh, it's very
Is that an
interesting.
actual movie, like a 2-hour movie?
No, it's a documentary on the star of
Oh,
the star and when it, when Christ was born and that kind of thing.
nice.
So every time we dig something up, some people then they start readjusting things. So a lot of what we understand about these days has to do with the copies we have of Josephus. So people are now, because of newer copies of Josephus being discovered, people are putting like the death of Herod at 2 BC and things like that. So it always changes. So it just becomes a question of authority. Why would I believe Josephus over Luke in the first place? I mean, it's an arbitrary decision. So I think Luke is right and Josephus is wrong. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. That's kind of what I want to say to people who say that. They say, oh, okay. All right. Last issue we're going to deal with today is, we won't deal with it. I think we're good. The birth of Christ. Let me say that there is this person named Simeon who testifies that Jesus is Christ, and then there's the prophetess Anna. And in verse 36, I want to just read this real quick. It says, "And there was a prophetess Anna, daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher." Now, when we talked about that, we were talking about last time, that means that the northern tribes that stayed faithful, the people in those northern tribes that stayed faithful, migrated to the south. Because we know this because she's from the north, because Asher was a northern tribe, and they're gone. They migrated south to stay faithful. She lived and was advanced in years and lived with her husband 7 years from her virginity, and she was a widow for 84 years. This girl, probably around 103 years old, 104 years old at this time. So well advanced in years. And she did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer day and night. And coming up to the very hour, she began to give thanks to God and spake to him all who were waiting for the redemption of Israel. What's important about this is that God gives more than one witness to the validity. So it's not just Mary and Joseph, it's Mary and Joseph and Simeon and Anna who all testify about the importance of the birth of Christ. All right, any questions? No?
Not about this stuff.
That's something else?
Yeah, after you pray. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right.